Good evening and welcome. I'm Susan Murray, Director of the David Hume Institute. For those of you joining us for the first time, we're an independent Scottish think tank established in 1985. A link to our website is in the chat if you would like to find out more about our work. Thank you for joining us on such a sunny evening for what I'm sure will be another lively and thought-provoking discussion. Today, our event is brought to you in partnership with the University of Glasgow and Policy Scotland. We're going to discuss new research by Professor Duncan Maclennan, which investigates a Scotland of better places through conversations with over 600 people as part of the Action Project. This research lays out thoughts on Scotland as a country of connected people and places. We're a small nation with a dispersed population roughly half the size of London. We have rich nature, landscape and history, but not all places in Scotland are thriving. COVID has fundamentally changed how people connect to the places in which they live, work and play. It has exacerbated stark inequalities so that those with resources have been able to consolidate, while those without, often in insecure employment and with little if any personal reserves, see increased risks and costs. The need to rebuild the economy and society in the wake of COVID-19 gives us a unique opportunity to re-examine and perhaps reinvent how we think about Scotland, its places and the people. In 2020, the David Hume Institute embarked on an ambitious project to investigate the actions that would take Scotland further and faster towards a country that is prosperous, sustainable, inclusive and fair. Having spoken to over 4,500 people in the last 9 months about actions for individuals and communities, organisations and governments, we released the initial findings at Easter about people's priorities for action, and the Place report is the next stage of the work. Just before we get started, a few things about how the event will work. We're recording the session and it will be uploaded to the website afterwards. There will be approximately 20 minutes of panel conversation before we move to questions from the audience. For the questions, please post them in the Q&A and then we'll invite you to unmute so you can ask your question directly. When asking your question, please state your name and, if applicable, your organisation. If you're unable to unmute, please just let us know. And as we near the end of the event, I may group questions to try and get through as many as possible. So without further ado, we welcome our speakers, Professor Duncan Maclennan from the University of Glasgow, a renowned expert in global place policy, and Deputy First Minister and Cabinet Secretary for COVID Recovery, Mr. Swinney MSP. I'm delighted to welcome Duncan and John, as well as the audience, to what I'm sure will be a fascinating discussion. So without further ado, Duncan, can you give us an overview of your research, please?
Thanks very much, Susan, and thanks to everybody for coming along on what I understand is a sunny evening. I'm in a rather misty part of Nova Scotia, but thank you for coming, and indeed to John Swinney for agreeing to comment on the work. I think that when we look at COVID-19, it's certainly unburied a lot of problems that quite often get glossed over. We know that the worst affected people have been the poorest people, and the worst affected people, the poorest people, are those that are concentrated in difficult neighbourhoods. In other words, the left behind neighbourhoods, the left behind communities get pushed further and locked further behind. But there's a second thing that comes out of looking at COVID, and it is a recognition in that how we've dealt with it, whether rich or poor. It's about social and economic and environmental and other considerations that interact round about our homes, how we use our homes, how we use our neighbourhoods, how we're able to do that. And it reminds us that the home and the neighbourhood, as much as the workplace or the university, are where we lead our lives, our economic life. The economy, like charity, begins at home, and increasingly so. The neighbourhood is the other context that really influences what we do. But very often, when we're making big economic policy, we kind of assume these connections away. It's about the flow of labour, it's about capital. Yes, it is about these things, but it's also about community. And I make this point because too often we think of community and place as a problem. It's a problem of disadvantage that we have to solve by redistributive policy. I'm suggesting to you, and I think that's the basis of a lot of Scottish policy thinking. We have to think of neighbourhoods and homes and communities as creative places. It's where the interactions that spark a lot of progressive and positive change take place. So we have to, going forward, when we're building the future, we have to think about how can we better capture the creative dynamic of what happens in neighbourhoods and places. So that's one preliminary. The second preliminary is that in many ways, Scotland does a place-in-place policy really well and has done so for a long time. The HIDB from the 1960s introduced community and economy into rural policy in a way that other places didn't do until 30 or 40 years later. The community-based associations in Glasgow had a real dynamic from the middle of the 1970s until even now, in some instances, that actually changed places, that took them away from the powers of drug dealers and the incidence of crime to a driving force for improvement. So we know that these things happen, and we know that there are things that we do. That said, I think the good things in Scotland about place policy are political will. The Scottish Government have been very clearly committed to talking about place in different sectors of policy for different areas, rural and urban. And I think that in relation to ideas for change, there's almost too many ideas for change. Now, it's odd for an academic to say that, well, even when they haven't invented them. But there is, I think, a need for some real clarity. We need, I think, a much clearer narrative for policy. I agree with inclusion. I agree with well-being. I agree with sustainable development. I agree with all their aims. But I find it really difficult when I work with communities in Scotland, when these big ideas get dumped on them, basically from the Scottish Government downwards, or occasionally from Westminster. They're often into contexts where the thinking capacity of local governments and indeed non-profits have been stripped away by cuts and decades of austerity. So people spend ages trying to think, what does this mean? In fact, we've been talking about inclusive growth for 5 years. And in fact, I think there's been as much discussion about what it is as opposed to how we actually do it. So I just make that general point that I would make a plea to government in Scotland to be much clearer, use the national performance framework to identify the clear objectives that there are, talk about the techniques, develop the good place policy advice that's come out of planning, etc., in the Scottish Government. But there's a complexity of agendas that's getting a bit much, I think, for people on the ground. Now, against that general background, in the recommendation, you might call it the Hines report, there's 57 recommendations. I didn't do that deliberately, but that's how it turned out. I want to pick 6 big things that I think are important and then move on quickly. I think, first of all, there has to be a real focus on decentralisation and devolution within Scotland. Scotland has very big local authorities by OECD or international standards. It also has, by international standards, following the UK model, one of the most centralised finance systems and local government systems in the world. And I don't think that that's a good basis in which very often communities in rural areas particularly see the local governments quite remote from them. Now, that's not a good basis for change. So we have to think about how we devolve and get powers essentially down to local authorities and within local authorities to communities. I think that once we devolve, we have to think much more effectively about involving communities in place. Some local authorities like East Ayrshire do a great job, others not so much. We had much debate in our webinars about whether or not, given we now are interested in community wealth, community energy descent or environmental improvement at local scales, community land, community wealth, community housing. Perhaps we need some support from an agency at regional or national level of a technical nature and in terms of innovative finance to actually begin to work again with communities to deliver change. I realise it's a point of debate, but in some places things go forward really easily. In others, in our webinars, that's not the case. The third thing would be to say that within communities, we've got to look at our supply chain for creating places. In other words, the homes, the infrastructure, the connections within them and between them. Our supply chain is inflexible and fragmented, and the price and delays involved in that raise the costs for everything. If we're going to achieve the objectives of housing, which I think are very laudable for 2040, we've got to have lower house price inflation. That starts with lower land price inflation. It starts with having a much more flexible system for the supply of place. So I think that we should be looking at the very least at the regional partnership level to audit the supply of place within regions and communities and seek improvements, have a remit to improve it. I think the fourth thing, and following on from that, and again, this is longer term, these are not easy issues, but ultimately, I think this is the great failure of devolution over the long period. Parties have not tackled what is clearly an inefficient and inadequate local tax system. The taxation of land, the taxation of environmental bads, local government taxation, we do need to really make a commitment to think about devolving power and changing that tax system. I know it's not a quick thing, but it will take time. The fourth thing I want to say, of the six, is that we have to actually think about the role of housing in economic development in all communities, and particularly rural. We think of housing as a social outcome, but housing and its prices have really important effects on the economy of the communities. They distort investment patterns, they put burdens on people in terms of what they can spend money on, but certainly thinking much more coherently within regional partnerships, within community local development. Take the housing dimension of it seriously, because from an economic point of view at the moment, I don't think that's what happens. Finally, I want to say something about rural areas, which in many regards was the most exciting part of our discussion. And it is that within the rural context, I think that the arguments for an extension of community ownership of land are really unanswerable. There hasn't been an overall cost benefit of or assessment of the schemes that there have been, but certainly there's lots of prima facie evidence that they're a success. There's also still an awful lot of estates that do very little, and that where energy could be unleashed, where lives could be led in rural areas and population significantly increase. I think that's an absolute imperative that we expand that programme, but also as we do, looking beyond the community. The critical thing in rural areas for me needs a new narrative, and it needs Scottish Government to deliver on the priorities that have been agreed, because there's a real sense of not so much multiple disadvantage, but multiple disappointment in the rural areas that pretty much agreed strategies had not rolled forward. And at the heart of these, it wasn't the traditional forestry and farming, the big sectors we often think in rural. The big employment, the big change, the positive thing in rural Scotland is the fact there are so many entrepreneurial individuals moving to rural areas, or already in rural areas, who are taking the opportunities of new technologies, new possibilities to form micro-business. It was really stunning, the extent to which that has made progress in difficult circumstances, but there has to be a really positive thinking about how the extension of broadband and new markets and new population in rural areas are actually beginning to make a significant change. So these are the 6 big areas of action that I particularly wanted to emphasize. But of course, there are many more nuanced points in the introduction. So apologies, Susan, for taking a little longer.
That's okay. Thanks, Duncan. So much food for thought there. Coming to you, John, what are your thoughts on priorities, and how does Scotland's places play a role in COVID's recovery?
Well, Susan, thank you very much, and I really welcome this opportunity to take part in the conversation with Duncan and with the contributors tonight. And let me start by thanking Duncan for a really substantial introduction to the conversation, and I've looked at the thoughts that Duncan has put together on this whole question, and we'll look more at that material as we formulate our COVID recovery strategy. What I think where I want to start is with a really clear point of agreement with Duncan, that the impact of COVID is such that nobody can look at the situation and say anything other than we have to do things differently to what we've been doing up until now. We cannot look at the experience and the impact of COVID without coming to the conclusion that we have got to adapt and change the way in which we are operating. And one of the big lessons for me of COVID, in terms of the response within our society, is that the very successful examples of how people have managed their way through the incredible disruption of COVID is that solutions were often found within localities without them being prescribed from outside those localities. So people in communities supported each other, they found ways of working, they unleashed a spirit of assisting individuals who faced some challenges. Now, that spirit to me has always existed. I represent largely a rural constituency. I see much of that spirit available and prevalent in many of the communities that I represent on an ongoing basis. But I think we saw it really to the fore in almost all communities within Scotland, where there was that degree of engagement and support to ensure that people's needs were met and their challenges were overcome. I'm anxious, and the government's anxious, that we try to find a channel for that way of working and that approach in how we address the response to COVID and the recovery from COVID. And that requires us then to change some of the practices through which we operate. We have to find ways of ensuring that we are able to equip and support communities in a way to realise their potential. Now, one of the points that Duncan made was around, one of the 6 points was around the whole question of decentralisation. And I accept the analysis that our local authorities are by and large larger than most kind of comparable local authorities. I think the question that we've got to answer, and we've struggled with this question for some time as a society, is how do we effectively and satisfactorily support the empowering of communities? Because it's within the empowering of communities that I think many of the solutions to the challenges of COVID were actually found. So I'm interested very much in a conversation about how we can find the means of empowering communities to provide essentially that genesis of approaches and actions which can result in good outcomes for individuals at local level. Because that pursuit of good outcomes is a product of, will be a product of the work that we can do to try to tackle some of the fundamental inequalities and injustices that COVID has accentuated as a consequence of its impact. So what we're looking at in government is a whole series of areas of work as to how we can properly and effectively support communities to essentially build the capacity that's necessary to deliver the type of intervention that was delivered during COVID. Now, the pursuit of that is quite challenging, and one thing I'm absolutely certain will prevent it happening is if we deliver policy in the way that policy is often delivered in, and the sense of kind of uniform public service programmes across the country. I think we've got to find solutions that cross those boundaries, and you might not be surprised to hear me saying that, given the nature of the responsibilities the First Minister has asked me to take forward in this government. Because what the First Minister has asked me to do is to make sure that we work across policy barriers and boundaries to focus on delivering solutions that will transform lives for individuals. So a lot of the discussion that's going on within the groupings that I'm leading within government now, in the very short space in time since the election, are focused on how we answer difficult questions around moving from essentially portfolio and policy-based solutions to problems to essentially people-based solutions to those problems and challenges. So how do we, for families that face difficulties and challenges, how do we ensure that we wrap public services around individuals rather than requiring individuals to interact with the public services that we decide to make available to people? And that involves a fundamental change in thinking about how we deliver policy and how we empower communities to enable those communities to thrive as a consequence. Because if we can make progress on that, I think we've got more chance of creating more sustainable and successful policy interventions for individuals and for communities than if we essentially decide within government, these are the policy approaches we're going to take and we will roll them out across the country. And finding that that way of empowering communities lies at the heart of much of that thinking. Now, what we're trying to do in this work, and I'm now leading these discussions within government, is to find ways of focusing more and more of our thinking on the challenges that people face rather than on the policy approaches that we design. So that's about, what I've said to my ministerial colleagues. Our conversations are essentially to reflect on the thankfully now demised presidency of Donald Trump, how we can build bridges and not erect walls in policy making. So what I'm trying to do is and I'm doing this now actively with a number of groups within government, one group bringing together all of our ministers with an interest in public services, about how we bring those policy interventions together to make them much more cohesive and much more in tune with community-based solutions. And what we also do in the amongst ministers interested in economic impact, how we an opportunity and formulation of opportunities, how we bring them together in building cohesive cross-portfolio areas of intervention, which will inevitably focus much more on what we can do in individual places to create better opportunities and better prospects for individuals. So that focus on building cohesive policy approaches across boundaries, focusing on individuals, focusing on places, will very much underpin the approach that we take to COVID recovery. Now, as we wrestle with that, I think we've got to address quite a number of the key points that Duncan raised about decentralisation, about how we reach communities, not just local authorities. We have to identify the role of communities in place formulation. I was struck by a radio piece that I heard just the other day about West Kilbride, and where a whole series of difficulties and challenges had led West Kilbride to formulate an approach to defining the town as a craft town and to provide that as a means of regenerating property, and activity, and providing reasons for people to be proud and engaged in the vibrancy of a redefined community. The other example in the radio piece was Campbelltown, a community that I know well. It's had to redefine its purpose and is increasingly trying to do that. And indeed, the work that's been reflected about the Kintyre 66 route is another example of how place-based solutions can be taken forward to try to create stronger and better opportunities for communities. There are going to be some real challenges about the purposing of many of our towns, given some of the fundamental shifts in consumer behaviour that have taken place during COVID. And we need to watch with care as to how those are, how long-standing those become, and how we purpose communities for which there may well be a role for the housing movement in some of these different possibilities. So there's a lot for us to think through about navigating our way through what the implications are of COVID, what that means for the design of our communities, and what it means for the way in which our communities engage in finding some of those solutions. And the government will be very much open to being engaged on many of these questions as we plot our approach to COVID recovery. And I think what the last thing I would say at this stage is that, you know, our minds are not yet closed on what the approach is and the route is to COVID recovery, because we're not absolutely crystal clear about what is the situation from which we are recovering. That is still an emerging picture, and we must remain open to reflecting on what is the nature of the community challenge, the economic challenge, the employment challenge, the housing challenge, the educational challenge, the poverty challenge that emerges. But what we're trying to do is to look at all of these various issues and identify formulate a focused strategy that will enable us to navigate our way through these multiple challenges and get Scotland onto a path to recovery that involves our communities being absolutely central to how we go about that challenge. And in that respect, I'm sure tonight's discussion will help, but I've committed, you know, we've been in office for, we're just coming up to kind of just about week 2, and already last week was the subject of intense discussion and dialogue with a whole range of different voices in Scotland to identify how best we can weave that picture together, and the government's very committed to do so.
Thanks, John. The term that came up the most was communities. So I'm going to draw in now, if it's okay, Angela Watt, who's been involved in some of the place conversations. Angela, do you want to unmute and make a reflection on the report and John's comments?
Hello there. Yes, thank you, Susan. Sorry, technology, it just kicked me out for a moment as you mentioned my name. So it wasn't me running, honestly. Firstly, Susan, when you started off by mentioning how everything has changed from COVID, I find that really interesting because it sits in a peculiar position with the word recovery. Duncan, you went on and wow, you covered so much ground on all the work that you've been doing. I thought I'll take a few points, but I don't even know where to start. So for instance, from the big ideas you talked about being dumped down from the hierarchical policy. And then John, I'd prepared today, I'd got really organized to be able to go through a whole range of community positives to be able to share with you today and to highlight a big question. But your positivity, your openness and transparency about focusing on a collaborative way for transformation has been really exciting. So I'm just dumping all my notes now, okay, Susan, and I just want to bring it right back to the individuals. So as Susan mentioned, I founded an organization called Resonate Together just over 10 years ago in Alloa, Clackmannanshire. And as we know, we have complex, multiple levels of challenges within our small wee county. The thing that you touched on, Minister, about the individuals across Scotland, which is core to this recovery or this positive new direction, is about the individual spirit. And within Clackmannanshire, I've been fortunate enough to live here for 20 years. I know that every single person that we've been involved with, the thousands of people that have come through within Resonate, come through our venue, mixed in with the activities, each individual is unique. And when we talk about place, each individual local place, whether it's a town, a village, is driven by local purpose. And we need to understand that actually these are hubs of their own learning systems. So when we talked about COVID and the reaction that volunteers across the country, how everyone stepped up and helped each other locally, we have a system. We just don't have the language to be able to communicate what that system is, because it's constantly learning, it's completely agile and always changing. And so if we're going to build an interconnected Scotland to ensure that our country is flourishing, we need to understand this creative mindset that Duncan also touched on. This level playing field that we need. Duncan, you mentioned about the internet and being able to access it in rural communities, helping entrepreneurs to move out. Well, I can also tell you that in the centre of our town, there are spots where people cannot connect on the internet. So creating a Scotland-wide strong network for all communities to step up, these areas are absolutely in need of support. Gosh, there's so many things that could go on, and I know Susan's given me 2 minutes. But really, I think what we all have been discussing, if I was to sum it up in my heartfelt, passionate way, as I always do, is we feel that COVID has enabled us to see things clearly. We've constantly, in the 10 years that I've been running Resonate as a volunteer, we've constantly talked about this need for recovery, for doing things differently, for the inequalities that go on and how we're going to fight and change it. But actually, we're now talking about this pivot point. So, Minister, you said about how do we bring this together? How do we find the solutions? And I must admit, from all the amazing visits that we've had from ministers, from MPs, from MSPs, from European ministers, through to the Scottish Government directors like Eleanor Mitchell, Kenneth Hogg, Paul Gray, Paul Johnston, Director General, everybody talks about the way that Resonate has been working, and I know it's echoed across Scotland and beyond. The fact that we are a citizen-centred organisation and we work with the complexity around each individual for their own benefit and to connect them with others to help ensure that our whole system approach to community becomes resilient. So I'd like to ask you, can I be on your task force, please?
Forever to the point, Angela. Now, we are rapidly eating into our time because there is so much to discuss. There's a few people coming up with specific questions, but before I allow John to answer that one, I'm going to give you a bit of breathing space, John, and I want to bring in Caroline Sawyers, if that's okay, you've been involved, Caroline, both through the Cora Foundation's getting alongside communities and also Scottish Canals Board Place Regeneration. I'd be really interested to know your reflections on Duncan's report, if you're able to unmute. Fantastic, Caroline.
I am. Thank you so much, and sorry again for the pause. Similar experience to Angela there, and you think after a year and a half of Zoom I'd be really used to it. So Susan, just in the quick couple of minutes, thank you again both to Deputy First Minister Professor Maclennan for great inputs, and I hope what Angela and I say really complements. So Cora's been working alongside 9 communities from Cumnock and East Ayrshire to Methil and Fife, really, alongside them to support the work they've been doing to connect and to develop ideas locally. And I have to say, like, sometimes we meet people who are unsure that they have the power to bring about change, and sometimes we meet people who have lost a bit of faith and belief that change will ever happen. And of course tonight we're talking a bit about what's difficult and what's challenging about and what's hard about place. But let me add just a wee word about what's also wonderful. We see highly engaged communities, people who are really proud of their place and have so many skills to offer. And what we see is that when things start to happen from you know, community created wellbeing programmes to bustling community centres to local anti-poverty initiatives, people start to show the power that they do have, and that power usually grows. And I have to say that the people the communities we work alongside often identify a sense or a feeling of lack of investment in their place. You know, in a historical sense, they speak about the loss of historic buildings that matter to them, loss of key employers or places of work, a shifting pattern of public service delivery, and sometimes the loss of green space as well. You know, a place to meet, to have a coffee with someone, that wee cafe or the local community centre that feels welcoming. Sometimes that feels like the most important thing that's been lost or could be built back. And at Cora, we've started to talk about this as agenda-free space. And it might be that in Scotland, I think we've become really good at creating multifunctional public service space, but we might need to take care, I think, that public spaces aren't always about kind of fixing what's wrong. And an interesting lesson from our point of view is that it doesn't always take that much funding to get things happening. As it happens, I'm also on the board of Scottish Canals, and I see how it as a public body has really been working to regenerate places very much in partnership with the communities around the canals. And I think in Scotland we've got the ingenuity to make that happen. And as John Swinney spoke earlier, we've all seen across the last year how much people are prepared to put into, they're prepared to put an extraordinary effort, I think, into investing in their place, into looking after their neighbours. So, you know, just to conclude on my point, my ask, I suppose, is that I'm listening out tonight to hear from Deputy First Minister, hear from Professor Maclennan, really about how placemaking in Scotland can always make sure it sees the people in place.
Thanks, Caroline. That's really important. You mentioned highly engaged. I'm now going to come to Molly, who's an MSYP, because we worked really closely with the Scottish Youth Parliament throughout this. So before I allow Duncan and John the chance to answer both of the questions put by Caroline and Angela, I'm going to bring in Molly. Are you able to unmute and ask your question, Molly? Fantastic. Thanks. Technology's working.
Yeah, hi. Sorry, I've just realized the technology as well is not working on my end very well. I completely agree with everything that's been said so far, especially with Duncan and John's points about decentralization and about bringing power into local communities. I think first to introduce myself, I'm Molly. I'm the MSYP, which means member of the Scottish Youth Parliament for Caithness, Sullivan and Ross. So I completely understand everything that's been said already about rural communities and experiences of living in a rural community during the pandemic. I think that one of the things that we've been looking at this year at the Scottish Youth Parliament is about introducing a human rights-based approach to the way that to recovery and tackling kind of any problem that should be arise, whether it be in the medical sector, any sector, really. To tackle it with people in mind, which is just what everyone else has been saying, kind of summarizing more eloquently than I've been able to so far. But I really appreciate all of the thoughts that have already come through. I think one of the things that was mentioned in the report that is a very big issue for young people specifically is mental health and access to appropriate mental health care. So that's something I'd quite like to hear a bit more from John and Duncan as well.
Thanks, Molly. So if I give Duncan and John a chance to come back on those, and then we will try and rattle through all the questions that are coming in, if that's okay. Duncan, do you want to come first or John?
I'm happy to let John go first.
Right, thanks very much, Susan. I think there's a common theme that runs through Angela and Caroline's points, and it's almost like when I think about what I'm about to say, it kind of has all the hallmarks of a statement of the bleeding obvious, but I'm going to say it nonetheless. Why would you not think that people should be at the heart of the strategy that we take forward to create dynamic places within our society? But we're actually having to sort of almost reinforce the importance of doing that, and I want to reinforce that point. Very much at the heart of our thinking is the need to shift the focus away from government thinking about what it essentially delivers to people and how we have to shift it on to how does the provision of service transform the lives of individuals? Because if the former strategy had been successful, we wouldn't have learnt the lessons in COVID that we have learnt about the role of communities and what communities can do to enhance lives. So what I'd want to assure Angela about is that the type of ethos that Resonate Together has concentrated on feels very much in the territory that I'm trying to get the government's response focused around, about how we essentially wrap public services around people rather than requiring people to fit in with the public services that we decide to deliver, because there's a big difference between those two things. And I'm glad that so many of my colleagues have been to interact with you, Angela, so they'll be able to share with me some of that expertise, and we will of course listen directly to you into the bargain. And I hope that commitment addresses Carolyn's point about the role of where we see people in the placemaking strategy, because that to me is it's critical that we that people are absolutely central to that strategy. Then on Molly's point, Molly talked about the mental well-being of young people, and this is an issue that we are looking at very closely to determine what is, part of what I'm trying to do is to bring a real focus to where we can have an impact on improving people's lives through COVID recovery. And one of the areas that we're looking at as to whether, which may be the key to focusing that work, is around the mental well-being of young people. Now, I don't want that to be considered quite simply within the context of a rather narrow question about how can we make child and adult mental health services more available to young people. That's one part of the answer. But another part of it is about the quality of our natural environment, the access to the natural environment. What is contributing to the well-being of young people? What are the experiences? Many young people have had to go through an experience over the last 12 months, which I grieve for them about, because they've lost so much connection and relationship to others. What is it we have to go through, which is not just about child and adult mental health services, but about experiences and engagement and opportunities for young people, which will actually enable them to recover from COVID, because they've gone through a lot of suffering in COVID. So it's about a broader appreciation of what can be done within our communities to support the mental well-being of young people, as opposed to thinking what are the public services we need to deliver to support the mental well-being of children and young people.
Thanks, John. Duncan?
Unusually for a university professor, I'm finding it difficult to disagree with anything that anybody's said at this point. I agree pretty strongly with what John and the other contributors have said. Let's work something back. Molly made the point about mental health, and that came through in the discussions. Also, I do work in Australia and Canada, and it comes through there too, in terms of young people being uncertain about their lives and their prospects, and being able to stay in the place that they love. Some want to go away, many want to stay. I think that the Scottish Youth Survey indicated that 75% of people that live in the rural areas, of young people, are confident about the places that they're in and their long-term future. But there's these uncertainties, and the uncertainties come out as well, if I can get a job, can I get a house? I mean, these are the two really, really critical ones. Well, let's work back in terms of government delivery of whether you give people any comfort. Now, this would be true whether it was in a town, possibly a city, but certainly in a rural area. I think that there are two things in the delivery, and it's quite a long chain to effective work in the communities. I think that the way social and economic systems work, they work at two geographic scales. They work at strategic regions where labour markets and housing markets work, and they work at homes and neighbourhoods where people live on a daily basis. In terms of the big strategic decisions, that's critical. And I think the regional economic partnerships have been a real step forward in Scotland in sets of local authorities making strategic decisions about investment and so on. They've got to continue that. And just to refer to the UK government, they have to play into that as well. I fail to understand why, having encouraged everybody to collaborate through the formation of the city deals, they now propose to have a levelling up fund, which they will allocate to individual local authorities. That to me runs counter to the kind of need to all governments to be working together to get a strategic framework about how they're going to, at least down to the community level, have the transport and the housing and other decisions in place. Once you get below that, different solutions. If the local authority has got the resources and the inclination to actually make the commitment in communities to integrate services, as East Ayrshire, as I referred to earlier, have. But in some other instances, in communities, people feel that local authority staff work for the local authority rather than them. And that sense has to change. And in that regard, I think the role of non-profits, and particularly where community ownership of the non-profit is involved, I do think that makes a particularly important difference. It's been important in the cities. The Towns Review, which I fully support and we haven't referred to at all, but I think it's an important step forward. I think the Sparks did a great job in that regard. But taking out of the vehicles that can actually exist, that people can interact with, that people feel work for them. And that's why I make the point about integrating some of the services and activities into non-profits that can work locally. Now, I realise that that's something that you have to develop, not confrontationally with councils, but along with councils. But there has to be a reality about who can deliver effectively in a small town.
Thanks, Duncan. That leads us on to the question that's come in from Steve Kerr, who is the chair of the Edinburgh Association of Community Councils. He says, given Duncan's enthusiasm for devolved empowerment to communities, does he advocate for the empowerment of community councils, the most local level of statutory governance in Scotland?
Duncan would advocate that we actually look at all the possible solutions. It may well be that there's effective community councils, and I don't want to point out the awful video of an English community council that appeared about 2 months ago, where people basically, it was just as well they were online. And I know that's unfair. Some community councils will be very effective. It may well be that there's a choice between having a community council or putting your energies into running a non-profit. So I don't think there's a single answer, and I don't know enough about community councils in Edinburgh to say, yeah, you're absolutely the answer, but it's certainly one of the considerations.
Thanks, Duncan. I'm interested in, there's a question from Des McNulty about the Christie Commission. Des, can you unmute and ask your question, please?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, we're 10 years on from the Christie Commission, and one of the key themes in that was about prevention and preventative work. We haven't made as much progress as I'm sure John would like to see in terms of a shift towards prevention, partly because of financial constraints on local government, partly because the legislative pressures that they've been under. I mean, in the context of COVID recovery, are there, ways in which we can empower local authorities, local anchor institutions in different places, and allow community organisations to become more fully engaged in taking things forward on a preventative basis, as well as promoting resilience?
Thanks, Des. John, do you want to come in on that first?
Yeah, I do, and I think first of all, Des's assessment is, I think, fair comment. I don't think as much progress has been made on the shift to prevention as I would have liked to have seen. I'll not go through multiple reasons why not, but what I've said to in my direction to civil service since the government was re-elected is, I want you all to go back and reread the Christie Commission, because everything that I'm going to be banging on about in my new role is essentially anchored in the thinking that emerged from the Christie Commission. So that will be, so therefore, A, I think that's valid, and B, I think in the context of COVID recovery, it provides many of the solutions to some of the challenges that we've talked about. And it also relates to the question that you just put to Duncan about the role of community councils. I tend to take Duncan's view that I'm not sure it's as uniform as just saying, let's empower community councils. I think there's a variety of different organisations in localities that are delivering a profound impact on people's lives. If they were to be supported, enabled to do more, I think we'd probably see better outcomes. And a lot of those outcomes would come in the field of prevention as envisaged by the Christie Commission. So I think, I'm interested in trying to weave together a lot of these sentiments as we take forward our policy agenda in that respect.
So can I be cheeky then, John, and ask a question on the back of Des's? Sorry, this is going to be the big one. If Christie was good and everyone seems to recommend, it's really good, let's go back and read it and look, why haven't we made more progress in 10 years?
I think we haven't truly embraced the need to work outside of narrow portfolio boundaries. So I think, despite the fact that we have made some progress on prevention, but there's still too much silo-based operation. If I think about, let's say, for example, that the focal point of the government was to eradicate child poverty, which is, absolutely central to the government's agenda. You couldn't possibly deliver that through a portfolio-based proposition. Indeed, the world that I've just left as Education Secretary, you can't close the poverty-related attainment gap just by taking action in schools. It's not possible. You have to have broader cross-governmental policy approaches. Now, I'm sitting here on this webinar acknowledging and accepting that we've got to deliver that. That's what I'm in office to make sure happens. So I hope if I come back to a conversation about this in some years' time, you see the difference, Susan, because of the fact that we've consciously lifted the discussion up from individual portfolios doing this, that, and the next thing into what is the whole greater than the sum of the parts. And that's my challenge, to make the whole greater than the sum of the parts.
No, I think it's really good we're going back to Christie and not commissioning a new report, because I think there's so much in there that is about long-term change. But I think bringing in Steve's point about community councils, and I'll declare I do sit on a community council, we've really struggled with planning and new communities, and we know that some of the areas that are being built now don't comply with the new National Planning Framework 4. And we've spent hours trying, over about 8 years on the siting of a primary school. So using local knowledge, saying you need to have it central, you need walkable communities, all these things. We've not made a jot of difference. and that kind of worries me, because if that's a fairly active community council, and we've rolled out our sleeve, we've read all the different documents. It's really hard to bring change, and I think that's what we're struggling with. We've got really good policies that Duncan talks about, but actually moving to something different is challenging, I think. Duncan, what do you think about it all?
And I think that specifically in relation to Christie, I pretty much agree with Des, so I don't really want to go over that again. I think going back and look at some of these documents is helpful. But at the end of the day, the key thing is I'm most concerned about either individuals or organisations that will get into action on the ground and in communities. And I think we have to take some decisions fairly urgently about that. The question in community councils, I think, was perfectly valid, but in other areas, there's non-profit housing associations. In other places, it's development trusts. What is that map, and how do we support the people in particular places? Because I think this is quite urgent, and we are, and John's certainly conveyed the sense of urgency about building Scotland forward, and I think that we have to look to these potential vehicles. And I'm interested in, as you can tell, I'm interested in how you design the vehicles for change. I think we've really got to get on with that, and we've got to get some clarity. It strikes me almost that different portfolios within Scottish Government support different kinds of vehicles. So some coherence about what is emerging in places, I think, would be helpful.
Thanks, Duncan. I'm going to whiz through some of the questions and group them together. There's lots in their report, Duncan, about tax, and it seems to be that, you know, there's been various different things said over many years about tax and local taxation and how it should be done. What do you think the game changer is?
Well, I think that particularly for the places that are growing, there's just what we'd call a huge vertical fiscal imbalance. And this is true, we've talked about rural areas and less advantaged communities. But if you take a setting like Edinburgh, most of the tax revenue that's generated in Edinburgh goes somewhere else. But the problems of dealing with congestion of any kind, including absence of affordable housing, get left to decisions within central government. So that if growth creates the affordable housing difficulty, that's the problem in Edinburgh, the Poverty Commission identified. It really needs a scale of resources much greater than what comes back through the kind of formula from the top level. So balancing the fiscal system so that the resources that get generated by growth are also available to people to invest in the places that are growth. That's the first thing. In terms of specific local taxes, I think the critical thing is the way we've let the council tax drift in terms of values is problematic for everybody. There's a lot of a view that there should be a switch from land and buildings tax to a long-term land tax. And that's not impossible to do. Two of the Australian states, systems rather like us, have just recently managed to do it. So there's a big politics. Everyone puts off tax change. Every party in the parliament for 20 years has put off tax change, and everyone knows it's not an effective local tax system. It doesn't help local incentives, doesn't help dealing with problems within localities. So, sorry, that's probably too long an answer, but and I understand the dynamics of politics of why it doesn't happen. There really needs to be a cross-party agreement and need to change the local tax system.
John, do you think cross-party agreement could be possible to bring change in that, or do you think it's just off the table?
I'm sorry to sound pessimistic about this, but you know, it's not that the whole issue's been off the table. It's that it has proved impossible to get the necessary agreement to make much progress on any issues of substantive reform. So, you know, if I look back at what have been some pretty genuine attempts by people from different parties to try to come together in common cause on this question. We've never managed to get there. Now, we undertook some reform of council tax in the last Parliament. I would be the first to accept that it was marginal reform of the council tax, but I think that reflected the scale of challenge involved in trying to be able to do the reform that's been suggested in the question.
Thanks, John. Mark Diffley has asked a question about Scottish Land Fund. Mark, are you able to unmute and ask your question?
Hi, Susan.
Hi, Mark.
Hi, thanks, Susan. Hi, John. Hi, Duncan. Yeah, we were involved recently in an evaluation of the Scottish Land Fund, and it was extremely, it was seen and proved extremely successful. I think not just in enabling local communities to buy land and buildings for agreed local use, which is the purpose of it, but actually more broadly in bringing communities together, which appears, obviously is a theme of the report and of the discussion this evening. And I know, John, that the government is committed to doubling the value of the land fund over this term of Parliament. But I wonder, given its kind of proven success now, whether there's a need, particularly given what we're talking about in this discussion, for sort of a more ambitious fund, which is a bigger, more ambitious fund that we know can be successful, not just in the reuse of land and buildings, but in achieving some of these kind of community cohesion functions that we've been discussing this evening. I'd be interested to get your view on that. Oh, and Duncan's as well, of course.
Thanks, Mark. John, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I think the Scottish Land Fund has been very successful, a very beneficial intervention, but I don't think it just relates to the value of the fund as to what it actually triggers. I can think of a number of examples where the Scottish Land Fund, for example, has supported an original acquisition by a community. But what that has then created is capacity within the community. And I think this gets to the nub of some of the points that Duncan was raising and also that Carolyn was raising earlier on. It creates a capacity within the community, which then enables a whole series of other things to be done within that community, which create often greater sustainability for that whole community venture, or better outcomes for individuals, because the capacity is there to do ever more. I sometimes meet community organisations, my own constituency capacity, where people come to you maybe to try to pursue an opportunity, let's say to acquire a public building or something like that that's suddenly gone on the market, or a piece of land that they want to be able to take forward. But they don't actually have the capacity of a community organisation to enable it to be brought about. They've got aspiration, but they don't have capacity. When you see capacity and aspiration together, it is incredibly effective. And and then you can possibly bring in other components. I remember approving an investment by Hans Enterprise in a marina development in Loch Boisdale, which was an investment initiated by the community land company within South Uist. By the time the community land company had got to this concept of the marina, which was all about attracting sailboats to come into Loch Boisdale to regenerate activity within the area, they had built capacity through community investments, digital technologies, renewable energy technologies. So they were able to contemplate going to HIE and say, we need, I think if memory says, we need £5 million from you to contribute to this marina development. And that marina development then created further sustainability for the community land acquisition. So the relationship, there is a direct relationship between connection, between community capacity and community aspiration. And I think the more we can try to marry up those two, the more effective the outcomes will be.
Thanks, John. I'm going to come to Sam Hill next. Sam, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Hi, thank you, Susan. Hi, John. Hi, Duncan. So I work for MyDex CIC and Project Partnerships Officer. We're a social enterprise and community interest company whose social mission is to empower people with their personal data. And I was reading the report this afternoon and I saw that it says on page 11, it says, time and again, webinar participants advocated going beyond other initiatives to engage with wider community ownership, environmental projects, carbon reduction, infrastructure, and community income and wealth issues, and to foster partnerships, build local institutions, build local capacities to catalyse investment and provision for Scotland's communities. The recent Scottish Government digital strategy noted the importance of defining infrastructure beyond roads, wires, pipes, and all this kind of thing, and understanding that there is infrastructure in the ways that we deliver services. So notably over digital channels. I think that this has become, we've seen how fundamental digital infrastructure is during the pandemic, as it's often become the only means by which people can engage with government. However, different IT systems and platforms are used for people to interact with different services and to manage different personal data required by those services, and different systems used by different departments in the same local government and across different local authorities, all designed for those local authorities or those departments' needs. So I was just thinking, given Professor Maclennan's call for devolution within Scotland and Mr. Swinney's excellent call that we wrap public services around people rather than have people interact with services in a way that suits those services, what more can local authorities and other large public organisations do to ensure that citizens are at the centre of digital transformation rather than putting organisational needs first and inadvertently creating the sort of fragmentation that particularly makes the poorest people's lives harder?
Duncan, do you want to go first on that?
Yeah, I think it's appropriate since I'm using rural internet in Nova Scotia to answer the question. And one of our participants in the webinars making a very important point about micro business, and there were very many impressive women in Perthshire involved in micro business. But she said to us, government policy for our area is a bit like my internet, she said. It comes and goes. The very first thing that local authorities and others can do is ensure that there is effective broadband within the areas that they serve. I think in terms then of using data, again, I think there are a large number of pilot projects that have been done, whether it's in telehealth or managing housing or whatever. But this implementation gap that we were referring to earlier occurs again in these areas. Very often, the technology, the data, the ability of people to use the systems is in place, but it doesn't actually happen. Now, you're saying, and I would agree with you, that actually putting individuals at the centre of that would be hugely important in terms of stripping away the negative effects of distance, the lack of immediate face-to-face communication. So yeah, I think it's really important. And the point that was made, it's as important in some urban areas as indeed in rural. So I agree fully.
Thanks, Duncan. John, do you want to come anything quick? And we're rapidly running out of time if I'm going to wrap up on time. So
yeah, just I think there's two lessons that I take out of COVID about digital issues. The first is that if this had not happened in 2021, if COVID had happened in 2011, even, we would have been, we would have had real difficulties. Just 10 years ago, we would have been scuppered. Yeah. But so we were kind of save for being scuppered by the fact it happened in 2021 and digital technology was as accessible as it is. But my second point, access to digital technology was very, very uneven, and that was illustrated by COVID. So if I give you one example, we've got a situation where about 3 or 4 local authorities in Scotland have taken decisions to give every pupil in their schools a tablet or an iPad, everyone, and that's been their policy programme. But in 28 authorities, that's not. So you had irregular access in 28 authorities, and you had a good, clear access in 4. You just can't have that degree of local variation on something as fundamental as digital access, because without, to go back to my first point, without uniform digital access, how on earth would we have coped with this challenge? So a policy solution has been brought forward to address that, and we have to make sure that in terms of our overall policy approach in COVID recovery, digital access is a key part of that process.
Thanks, John. I think about how much I used Zoom before the pandemic and how much I use it now, and I don't think I even knew it existed before. So it's totally right. We would have been absolutely scuppered even 2 years ago, I think, for how much the world is changing and so quickly. Now it's 7:15, and I promised we would end on time, given it's such a beautiful evening. I hope no one is suffering harm anywhere, but it is lovely in Edinburgh here today. I know that Ewan Leach was keen to come in from Surf, so if you can bear with us for another minute. Ewan, do you want to unmute and just say a word from the Scottish Urban Regeneration Forum?
Thank you very much, Susan. I was about to leave, so I didn't think I was going to say anything. It's been a really interesting discussion. Hearing what I've also read Duncan's report, and hearing the Minister's response to that. There's obviously a lot in it for us. I would say it corresponds with a lot of what we've heard over the last year, with recommendations from Citizens Assembly, the Civic Renewal Advisory Board. We are all about implementation. We know what needs to be done. It's the how that we need to look at. And the 2 scales that we've discussed this evening, specifically around hyperlocal and regional, really need address. We've removed strategic development planning from legislation. Does that undermine where we go with regional planning? And I suppose, dispiritingly, retail bounce back is an out of time. Are we trying to address issues where the problem is already there and it's massive? And so we really need strong implementation of the policies and the principles that we've all discussed at length this evening. So it's great that we have somebody in John Swinney working across the silos. And it's also quite good to see within the new ministers' portfolios, not everyone can see themselves because the portfolios are split up. So where regeneration sits, it sits across directorates. And that is hopefully a good recognition that we will all have to work better in collaborating, and that civil servants at all levels and various governments will also have to work better at collaborating together. But really interesting event, and thank you very much for bringing me in at the very end. You were lucky. I was really about to run out into the sun.
Well, thank you for staying, Ewan, and I'm really pleased that was a good note to end us up on. It is a fascinating report, and one that I think needs reading more than once. So if for those of you that had a chance to read it this afternoon, please do go back and read it again. There is much food for thought in there, and things that I think we will need to come to and do smaller round tables or more detailed events on, because there is so much in there to think about. I'd really like to thank John and Duncan for being so open and honest today in the conversation, and to the audience for joining us on such a beautiful evening. And I think I was going to come to Duncan and John for one last word, but unless you can do it in a sentence, gentlemen, I'm tempted to wrap up. Would you like one last sentence, Duncan?
Yeah, I think we're talking about, in all of this, we're talking about remaking better connections in the economy. but we also remake politics in the process. And I think this is fundamentally important for how Scotland goes forward.
Thanks, Duncan. John, one last sentence.
Yeah, I would just like to reassure everybody about the determination to work across different and distinct policy interests to focus on people and changing their lives. And that's fundamentally how we're going to approach COVID recovery.
Thanks, John. And I think as part of the rest of the action project, what we really found from people across Scotland was a determination for everyone to roll up their sleeves and do what they can to make a difference to their lives and other people's. So I think we have a lot of very determined people. So hopefully we can bring change together. So good luck, everybody. Have a lovely evening and thank you all for your time. Goodbye.
Thank you.